Good morning. My name's Nicole Boothman-Shepard. I'm Vice President of Resilience and Recovery at AECOM, and I'm delighted to be dialing in to you today from Bali, Indonesia for the UN Risk Reduction Global Platform 2022. AECOM and the University of Hawaii are really honored to be part of the platform and have been invited to present an innovation platform, which involves 4 days of programming. And so this session is part of the innovation platform. We have a number of sub-themes, but our primary objective is to focus on the needs of remote island communities with sub-themes focused on governance, risk communication, and community engagement to leave no one behind. So this session is about governance, and it's specifically about optimizing procurement and contracting or tenders in order to maximize community benefit and values based on your needs, whether it is rapidly responding to a disaster event or shock or involves long-term recovery. And clearly the drivers and priorities that you embed in your procurement process are going to be reflective of where you need to go or your roadmap for procurement. So I want to talk to you about that. I'm going to be giving you a number of case examples and be talking about different components of the procurement and contracting process. One baseline is the expectation that there is absolute integrity in the procurement and contracting process, that you are able to conduct it without people on the selection committee or making decisions about selecting the vendor who have conflicts of interest or who in any way have influence or participation in the process if they don't belong in it. If they are not part of your team, if they are not evaluating the performance of the vendor, the price of the vendor to get you what you want in your procurement action, you need to do everything that you can to hold them outside of the process. And I don't say that lightly. I appreciate that in particular in dynamic post-disaster conditions where there are a lot of controls that come off, you're able to procure quickly, you don't need sometimes as many signatures, you can make decisions faster, you can choose not to advertise or advertise for a shorter period of time or select fewer vendors. All of those conditions facilitate undue interference that not just professionally compromises the process, but results in an investment that your community needs to live with that does not perform for the community, that doesn't deliver the value of the investment that was made into the asset. And again, I know that's difficult. I know that for some of you to do that, it is at great personal and or professional cost. But it is an absolute grounding principle of this session, and I didn't want to not say it in acknowledging how hard it is, particularly in post-disaster conditions, and that's the case all over the world. So I'm going to talk to you today about reframing procurement and contracting with a focus on three primary areas: quality, performance, and delivering co-benefits. And those are co-benefits for people and communities. That's environmental sustainability, that's stabilizing or catalyzing the local economy, as well as trying to drive back the adverse effects of climate change. So we're going to talk about the fact that this work is informed by about 20 years of practice administering procurements or monitoring them for government agencies and evaluating quality and integrity and performance outcomes. It also focuses on really expanding the aperture of effective procurement. Often procurement and contracting or tenders are put in a silo and procurement professionals conduct the procurement. I want to encourage you to make a longer table, build a longer table, and invite the technical experts you need to develop a really strong scope to outline your intended outcomes and make sure that the investments that you make yield generational gains, if it is for a long-term recovery or resolve urgent human needs in the immediate post-disaster period. We're also going to talk a little bit about concurrent hazards, the pandemic being one of them, and some strategies you can use to address those, and the importance of planning for post-disaster procurements today, in blue skies, as we like to call it, when conditions are normal, so that you can build a business process, get technical authorizations, assurance as part of your process ready to go, and so that you have a contracting process that can be put in place in a really expedient way. Please excuse the competing noise. I expect it to continue. We have some children playing outside, and that's a good thing. It means it's a good day, and it means that, you know, disaster has not struck in this place recently. So pardon the play in the background, but I have to say that I find it heartening. So let's talk about structuring for quality. I was talking about the procurement process and trying to protect it, essentially. And sometimes that means that you need to slow down in order to speed up. There is so much pressure, the urgent need to meet the conditions of individuals who are in difficult and life-affecting circumstances after disaster, and also for people who want to get work done as quickly as possible, right? Politicians and other people in your process are really going to be giving you a great deal of pressure to get the procurement out, get it done, show people that work is coming, that life-saving activity is about to start. And that's a real burden. But I want to encourage you to try to create space, to be intentional, to promote the best quality procurement that you can, again, so that you deliver, your time to delivery is faster, your quality is better, your price is better, and ultimately the building or infrastructure asset that you live with through the procurement process for generations in your community, right? We're talking for long-term recovery. We're talking about a building that will stand for 25 or 50 years. We're talking about a bridge or a water infrastructure program that might last 50, 75, even 100 years. So the seriousness of purpose that you can communicate to people about maintaining a process that yields outstanding outcomes is a responsibility, and I know you can do it, and I know you've done it before. So let's talk about using a team approach again. Get every technical person. You don't need all technical people. You don't need 20 people. This is not something you can do by a committee of 100 people. But you need a couple of key advisors who understand oversight of the project delivery, the engineering and the science that goes into building a robust program, and also the operations and maintenance folks. Very often they are kept out of the process, but the cost to maintain the facility is informed in large measure by the work that's done when it's built. And it needs to be built with a schedule for operations and maintenance so that it continues to meet its function decade after decade after decade. And that isn't done without cost. So understanding your budget, not just for the project, but also to maintain it, is critically important. And I encourage you to be one of the first people to bring O&M people to the conversation, because they are often, again, kind of put in their own silo for things after they're built. So also get your tech team involved, with the availability of GIS data such as Esri data or Google Maps, or information that can help you get pre and post disaster images so you understand conditions that you're writing scope to is really important. Where drones are available, and increasingly they're available around the world, where it's allowed to get drone footage of the disaster damage has been a real game changer in understanding conditions that will help you understand the project complexity, the condition difficulty to access a site, for example, and see some other conditions around that you might not normally think of. That might be endangered habitat, that might be in an area that is in a sacred cultural site, or where there's an archaeological site that has recently been developed, or a burial ground. These are the kinds of things that getting a little bit more information, panning out and looking at your site, help you understand and plan protections in your procurement for cultural assets, but also and then natural ecosystem, but then still get the work accomplished. I also want to talk to you about getting a reliable cost estimate in place. I know everyone says you can't get a cost estimate that's reliable. It's after a disaster. That's true, but you do have your baseline. You know what you pay pre-disaster. And if you haven't built any assets in a long time, as is often the case of governments that find themselves with infrastructure that's been damaged, that had been in use for 25, 50, 100 years, then you need to talk to your partners in other places that have a higher rate of development. You know, your closest urban city that has a lot of infrastructure. You need to understand how much it costs them to do it on a normal day. You need to think about how much more it's going to cost to have it done in your condition or your area, your remote condition, your remote island communities. You need to be building in the cost, the increased daily cost. So if you have to bring workers in, now your cost has to reflect absorbing lodging, food, transportation, bringing in all of the equipment for those individuals. It includes shipping in major construction equipment often. It includes all the other supplies that need to come into the supply chain. And you really need to be thinking about your schedule when you do this and the unique needs of a remote island community, not just about cost, but schedule in terms of time, because time is money. And so, you know, there might be ways you can structure your procurement where you get the supply chain going under contract without mobilizing all the construction workers, so that you're not having them sit there and have nothing to build because the supplies aren't online, or you haven't developed the management system to oversee the inventory, to protect the chain of custody of that inventory, make sure nobody's going to get their hands on it, and try to distribute it thinking that it's available aid for home repair or an important need, but not the need that you're procuring under the contract we're contemplating right now. So I do want you to think of that. We're going to talk about the best project delivery method, pricing, and again, ways in which you can enhance outcomes by design through the procurement process and really use it as a fulcrum to control quality, performance, and the delivery of co-benefits that are durably experienced by your community for generations. So let's talk about intended outcomes. One, we talked about being a transparent steward of the public trust. That continues to become absolutely mission critical. Let's talk about your priorities. Time to contract. We know, again, there's a lot of pressure to get that contract out and signed. So how quickly do you need to get the contract out? How quickly do you need milestones implemented and the contract overall to be completed? When do you need construction completion by? And when you reverse engineer that schedule, are there milestones that you need to be met by a certain point? I'll give you an example. You may have a school that is closed, but it is next to a highway where a bridge segment has collapsed, and you've got to repair that bridge segment in order to promote and restore essential traffic, and then day-to-day traffic, and get the economy kick-started after that. But you might need to close a road in order to, or stage, you might need a staging location for materials to build that bridge, but you also need to get the school open. So can you incentivize hitting that milestone sooner, so paying the contractor to hit an important milestone sooner, so that a road or staging area A can close, so that then you can start to get school reconstruction underway. So be thinking not just about your procurement, but like I said earlier, opening the aperture, thinking about what else is going on in the natural environment with regard to important cultural resources, with regard to other key drivers in recovery, whether those recovery priorities are your agency's responsibility or another agency's responsibility. Try to form a common operating picture so that you can plan together in order to have a seamless, or as seamless as possible in post-disaster conditions, delivery as possible. I also want you to think about alignment with funding and compliance requirements from your funder. Your funder is absolutely going to give you strings attached, and having integrity in procurement is absolutely a phenomenally important way to provide assurance to your funder. But those compliance requirements, if you're responsible for them and they need to be part of the contract, I encourage you to define them and put them in the contract term and build for your project managers, whether they're internal, self-performed by members of your agency staff, or their professional services, construction managers or project and construction managers. Make sure everyone's roles are clearly defined and put in those contract terms what those compliance requirements are. Because if you need documentation in order to provide assurance to the federal funder that there was integrity to the process, that every dollar that went into the process was used to build the asset that you're planning, put it on the contractor's responsibility to produce it. Provide the templates, the format, the direction. You want all that paper coming in, how you want it warehoused, what systems you want it in. Do you want things coming in Excel? Do you want them coming in PDF? How many signatures, whose signatures? All of those things you can define in addenda to the contract and make part of the agreement so that you are not chasing your contractor during delivery. I need that paper, I need that receipt, I need this information on your milestone performance based on the schedule or the number of homes you repaired or miles of roadway you stabilized. All of that should be defined in your contract so that you can have a conversation with your vendor if they're failing to perform that has some teeth. So I want to encourage you to think about that. I also want you to think about maximizing risk transfer to the contractor. The more clear your scope of work, the more clearly defined, the more set it is, the more you know about the post-disaster conditions you're working in and where you're trying to go in terms of objectives for the procurement, but also for the performance of the asset and the function it's going to play, potentially for generations in the community. Really all needs to be known so you can figure out how much risk you as an entity can transfer to the contractor and what's unreasonable. Because if you don't know your scope, if it's fuzzy, if it's undefined, if you don't know how complex it is, if you don't know if the surface layer of the roadway is damaged or all the aggregate underneath has to be reconstructed, if you quickly try to transfer it at a fixed price to the contractor, your contractor is going to be able to come back to you and say, you didn't put that in your scope. That's not in my contract. That's not in my scope. And you are going to be at risk of the sort of cannibalization by change order or death by 1,000 cuts through change orders from contractors. And you need to be, the alpha in control of your procurement action, be the alpha. And the way that you do that is to understand the degree of risk you are able to transfer based on what's known about the contract. And when I talked about whether or not you want to segregate your contract into a bifurcated procurement or two separate procurements to stabilize an asset now, and then separately plan for resilient and climate adaptive and sustainable reconstruction for the long-term recovery, that really is informed by how much you know about the scope. So you might enter into a contract now that's short, so therefore fewer costs, shorter time, more control, and the contractor goes out and works with you to provide really clear visibility on what needs to be done. You might pay more for that short contract in the short term because you have to share the risk with the contractor because they can't give you a fixed price with any assurance, but it does have you pay a little bit more up front to get the information you need to get a really strong fixed price for the delivery of, the big asset, whether it's a $500,000, single asset, or it's a $500 million, $1 billion system. Give yourself the freedom and time to be able to plan the long-term recovery, with the level of information that you need to control that procurement at the expense of, getting one out really quickly on a time and materials basis with a not to exceed cap, for example. Also, you need mechanisms to hold your contractor accountable that's more than just the piece of paper, right? Contract cancellation for some contractors is a huge penalty. Risk of being prohibited from procuring or bidding on contracts with your agency in the future or with your government agency might be a very important driver for performance and ethical conduct by your contractors. But it also might not mean a lot. And so you also need to make sure that you have control in your contract that gives you assurance that the work is going to be done well. And if it's not, that you can get somebody else in the contract price you've already negotiated to finish that work. And so what I'm really talking about is thinking about insurance and thinking about performance bonds. With regard to hazard insurance, you want to be thinking about and have defined in the contract who owns the responsibility if there's another disaster. We're going to talk about that towards the end of our session, but I'm going to continue to move on in the interest of using your time well. So let's talk about contract scope of work and cost controls. For contract scope of work, again, I've talked about it a lot. Understanding your scope is absolutely critical, and tying it to the way you contract and price work will be informed by how much you know about the scope that needs to be done, particularly in the rapid response or stabilization phase. But I also, whether it's for near-term rapid response and stabilization or long-term recovery of a new major capital expenditure or portfolio of projects, I want you to think about asset quality standards. I want you to think about asset performance standards. Are you going to build to international code? Is that sufficiently resilient? Does that address the climate threats that you face? So what asset performance standards must this facility be built to, and who's writing them? Are you using international code? Are you using already adopted local code? Are you, based on the post-disaster conditions, doing an interim adoption of a higher above code set of requirements for going forward, because maybe the asset that failed was built to the code that was in place at the time, and maybe it's a relatively new asset. Maybe you built it, in 2010 and it failed, for example. So let's also talk about putting in your scope of work. Again, I talked about it, your timelines for major milestones and construction completion and schedule. The way you contract for price and the way you incentivize time and hitting milestones will have to do with the terms and conditions you put in the contract. Also, it will be based on how you price the contract and your project delivery method, both of which significantly influence things like time to delivery and major milestone timelines. So I want you to be thinking about labor standards. Very often we bring in anyone that we think can hold a hammer to help us rebuild. We are so in need of reconstruction, and the human needs are so great that we don't feel like we have a strong pool of contractors to pull from, particularly in remote island locations that have small populations and very few workers. When I was working in the U.S. Virgin Islands after Hurricanes Irma and Maria, which were two back-to-back Cat 5 events that hit 12 days apart, their sort of federal register of construction contractors that they kind of report to the U.S. Department of Labor was that they had like 249 professionals in one area of construction. 249, and they had $8 billion in damage just to the public sector assets, not also the private sector and tourism and other significant drivers in their economy. So you need to understand your labor standards. You need to define what your criteria are, your qualifications for workers, and the compensation that you expect them to pay. So do you have defined prevailing wage requirements where you indicate by role how much people will be paid at a minimum? If you don't have those standards, you may want to implement them, or you may not be compelled to, or you may choose not to. But if you expect people to be citizens or permanent residents with work permits, it seems self-explanatory that is understood in the contract, but that isn't always the case. Put it in your contract. That might be a requirement of your federal funder. You might need to follow fair labor standards, and there might be requirements on citizenship and authorization to work as part of that contract. And if you're not monitoring and you haven't put it in the contract that you award, you are at risk of having funds deobligated. So that's one of the things I want you to think about. I also, we talked a little bit about supply chain assurance. I want you to think about what's available in the supply chain. What the vendor is supposed to bring. I'll give you an example. People like to say that they're going to bring their equipment, right? Construction contractors bring equipment. That's fairly well understood. But you need to understand if they own that equipment or if they rent that equipment. Because if they're trying to rent that equipment from an international firm and someone in Eastern Europe says they're going to be sending a front loader, that front loader might be promised already to 10 different agencies. You don't have that in hand. So if your contracting pool provides an incentive to own equipment, to demonstrate that people own working equipment, that they're going to be able to mobilize, that might be more important in terms of getting your job done and having supply chain assurance. I apologize again for the competing noise. So hang in, and hopefully it'll pass in a second. So I also want to talk to you about, aligning your scope of work to government and community needs. And we're going to talk a little bit more about culture bearing and other key components that most people don't put in their procurement because they don't feel like they have the right to. But in point of fact, you do, and there are ways you can do that in a way that is not overly burdensome, but does create a project that is aligned to the needs of your community and its values. So let's also talk about cost control. Again, I want you to try to get that reliable cost estimate. You're gonna maybe have history for how much things cost in your area previously. If not, go to your adjacent cities or metro areas, see if you can get that information, and then figure out what the cost escalation is going to be. There are no hard and fast rules, and it's much more difficult in a remote island community than anywhere else, or a remote community, or frontier community, depending upon where you live, than in other environments where people live in an area with a wide landmass in the United States, in Europe, in Australia, in somewhere that isn't made up like Indonesia of thousands of islands, where it's easy to mobilize things on surface transportation or on rail, or to sometimes just to fly in certain parts to keep things moving. So I want you to get a cost estimate. I want you to expect that you're probably going to be paying double for the first 3 months, double what you would normally pay, at least in the first 3 months of the contract. Usually in the first 6 months, you're still paying 50, 75, sometimes 100% more. But after that 6-month period, and you've begun to get really some infrastructure reset, where you have vendors that have brought equipment in, they have tools, building materials have come in, you've got generators and supply chain that gives you some assurance, well, then you've got some control and choice, and your prices should begin to come down. That means if you're going to issue a 2-year procurement, you should be looking at the cost curve or the spend curve, and you can ask for that in your procurement. You can say, we want your price, but I want to see how your price is, what your spend is going to be at the beginning, or like early mobilization or contract initiation, midpoint of construction, completion of most major milestones until you have substantial completion, and then you're just working on punch list items or the cleanup items to get the contract closed. So ask for that, and make sure that in a 3-year contract, your vendor is not trying to charge you as if it's the conditions in the absolute immediate aftermath. And sometimes you get re-socialized to having prices that are so high that you get this huge cost, and you're like, well, that's just how much things are cost. That's how much things cost now. But I can promise you, having worked on catastrophic disaster recovery after catastrophic disaster recovery, from Sandy, from Irma, from Maria, from major flooding, from tornadoes, from earthquakes, that prices do come down even in the post-disaster construction period, even in remote island communities. So make sure that you are getting a good value, and that your contractors are contemplating an attenuation towards, or step down towards, a new normal or new normal conditions after disaster. I also want you to build in terms and conditions for scope changes, right? Particularly in post-disaster conditions. Even when you think you've got like an absolutely fantastic scope, you're going to come across unplanned or unforeseen conditions. Things you could not have imagined were damaged, or things that you discovered you didn't know were there. So let's say you picked a new site, you did some utility testing, you did some ground trenching, you did some archaeological monitoring for the new site. So far, everything has come out clean. You start to dig a foundation or dig for pilings or piers, and boom, you hit something that has to be fixed. It's not the control of the contractor. They have to be compensated. The condition cannot remain the way it is. So maybe that means you need a bigger archaeology program. Maybe that means you need to work with the local utility and pay them $25,000, $50,000, $100,000 to fix a utility line that has been damaged because its location wasn't known. and you need to change the contract. You need the control in the business process, the process to propose, the process to evaluate, the process to approve in full or in part, and the process to negotiate price. And if you get as part of your project cost a basis of bid, even if it's fixed price, you can ask your contractor to give you a basis of bid. So how are they pricing linear feet of pipe? How are they pricing labor? How are they pricing components, concrete pipe, conduit, electrical wiring, all of those things, steel, concrete, all the things that you need to rebuild. Find out in a basis of bid how they've priced. Some contractors are not going to give you that information, or they're going to really fight with you about that. I think in rapid recovery, it's unreasonable to expect that from a contractor. You might be asking them to turn around a proposal or price proposal to you in 24 hours, in 48 hours, in a week. It's not reasonable for you to put a burden on them that they can't meet. But if you're talking about a portfolio for a program or a major asset, whether it's $100,000 or it's $100 million or it's $1 billion, you have the right to ask for what you need. Now, if you ask for too much, your contractors might say, we're not playing, there's enough work for me, I don't need to go to San Vincent, I'm gonna go to Dominica and get additional work, or I'm gonna go work in the Bahamas, or I can still go work in the British Virgin Islands. You know, all of those things are possible. So you do wanna be balanced in what you ask for, and you wanna save up kind of your big asks for your big projects, and make sure that you have the highest degree of control in relation to your spend. So I want to talk to you a little bit about project delivery methods now, and also again more a little bit about costs. But I want to give you a case example with regard to speed to contract and speed to delivery. I was working with Colorado Department of Transportation on a major flood recovery. They had about $850 million in damage to their roadway. It was over a very wide area. They had a number of watersheds in a mountainous area where water was careening down the mountain, destroying transportation infrastructure. It was an 80 kilometer by 325 kilometer area, or about 50 by 200 miles. And they had to get 800 rapid procurements on the street just to stabilize the roadways and begin to restore essential traffic. Again, they had, in this case, they had a canyon that collapsed, that divided communities, and we had cut off communities that were really in a part of the Rocky Mountains on the North Front Range, and they couldn't get any supplies in. And winter was just around the corner. So they did these 80 procurements, and they really had a best practice. They worked with the local contractors association, the Colorado Contractors Association, to invite pre-qualification, to expand their list of pre-qualified contractors, and then they made awards for pools. Normally in a disaster condition, CDOT would call 3 vendors and get 3 prices for scopes of work, and then make an award based on outreach to a minimum of 3 vendors, often more than that, 5, 7, 10 vendors. But with 80 projects, obviously they couldn't be on the phone calling over and over and over again to the same companies. So what they did was they worked in a pool, right? So they got from the CCA collaboration, they got good visibility and cooperation with the contractor community. The Colorado Contractors Association found out about where people were located, where they had capacity, how many laborers, what types of work they could do, what materials they had access to, if it was aggregate, if it was hot mix, if it was tar, if it was paint, you know, whatever it was to temporarily restore the roadway and essential traffic. And then they were able to evaluate project complexity at CDOT. The procurement folks looked at project complexity, they looked at the location, they looked at whether or not they could make the award. Let's say they had damage at an intersection between an interstate and a state highway. Well, normally they would make an award for the interstate and make an award for the state highway. But because there was damage in that entire area, they were able to work, often in cooperation with local government, to make one award to one contractor, even if it was managed in 2 separate schedules of values. So they kind of treated it as 2 separate contracts under one umbrella. They were able to make very quick awards and get things done. Their entire 80 project portfolio, including one monolithic project that was an $80 million contract, they were able to get that done in 90 days. And most of those contracts were stabilized, those roadways were stabilized within 30. So that was a really effective practice, and one that the Federal Highways Administration really thought made a lot of sense, because it still provided for a great deal of competition in the pool and a great deal of assurance on contract pricing that was cost reasonable. So let's talk about options for project delivery. Again, this slide deck you can access on the Hopin site if you are attending the UN Risk Reduction Global Platform 22, or on the Linktree site for our innovation platform. And if you want it, you can email me at nicole.boothman-shepard@aecom.com. I'm happy to get it out to you. So we're going to talk about project delivery with regard to design, bid, build, which is the traditional method, right? You design it, then you take the construction contract bidders, you take them to the site, you walk them around, you allow them to see the plans. They give you a price, typically a low bid or lump sum price based on that plan, and then you either monitor construction or you hire a professional services firm to oversee project management or project management and construction management to represent you as the owner in the delivery of the project. There's also design build, and in design build you have one owner and one contract. It has the designer and the builder. They work in parallel between design consultants and trade contractors. So usually there is a prime construction contractor, a prime designer, and then all the subcontractors come in together in one schedule. Generally, it's regarded that design build saves a lot of money. But in my experience, it saves a little money and a lot of time. So I've seen a design build project that over and over again, let's say that normally would have been slated for 30 months, 36 months, 2.5, 3 years, and they can shave down 6 months off that schedule, 8 months off that schedule. Now, if you issue design build, you have to understand what you do and don't get. When you give the contractor more autonomy to run the whole thing, and they're giving you a price, they get to make some decisions that you would normally make as the owner. And you need to understand that and be ready to monitor it effectively, but also give up controls. One of the things that people don't get from design build are typical design drawings. And increasingly we're using technology in a BIM environment, in a digital twin environment, to be able to do things electronically. But after disaster, you and I both know that often that is not realistic. It might be for a long-term recovery project, but certainly not for rapid repair. And even then, you might want a paper library so that when the electricity goes out, you still have access to the information that you need. And it doesn't mean that the work can't be done digitally, but you might want some redundancy because you're disaster smart to say that you want the paper. But in design build, often you will not get a normal design set of plans and then an as-built set of plans. And some clients find that to be a real liability, that they can't see and touch what went in the ground. There is no written record. And so if you want that and you're doing a design build contract, you can do that, just put it in the contract. Are you gonna have to pay for that? Yes, you will, but you'll get what you want. And that goes back to defining your intended outcomes for your procurement action that we talked about earlier. You can also hire a contractor under construction manager, general contractor, CMGC. That is very similar to and sometimes used interchangeably with the phrase construction manager at risk, or CMAR. And that means you hire one firm to do absolutely everything. And it sounds like design build, but it's not. In design build as an owner, you still have more control, more oversight, more consultation and engagement than you would in a CMGC or CMAR situation. It doesn't mean you lose control, but you need to really understand if your organization has developed the capacity to oversee, to put into contract and oversee this work well, including things like a guaranteed maximum price and other pricing mechanisms that happen after you award the contract, which is a little bit strange, feels very strange to me, but not to worry, there are safeguards, and you don't have to take the price that the contractor you hired gave you. If it is not reasonable and not consistent with your independent cost estimates, you can actually seek another vendor for construction, even in these innovative delivery environments sometimes. But again, understand the rules of engagement for innovative delivery. Sometimes they save you time, sometimes they save you money. A lot of time they give you a lot of bandwidth that's much needed so that your team and your engineers and your project managers can look after things going on all over the community and not just one project. So sometimes that's very important to have assurance that major projects are moving according to your needs based on your procurement that you've designed to get you where you want to go, but so that you can look at that with your peripheral vision and not be entirely focused on that procurement, but you can monitor while you're doing other things to get your entire post-disaster portfolio stabilized and get things to a new normal condition for all residents and have healthy conditions, safe conditions, and then also at the same time begin to start to plan for long-term recovery based on what you're learning in the emergency response period. So let's talk about an example about incentives for construction speed and quality. I was working on the Great Flood of 2016 in Louisiana. They had over 10,000, they have many homes damaged, but this project in particular provided stabilization repairs to get 10,000 households back into their largely single family homes, some multifamily, for multiple construction contractors. So AECOM oversaw on behalf of the Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, GOSEP, which is the state office of Louisiana, focused on emergency response and recovery, so civil protection. And they hired us to look after construction on 10,000 homes. We did case management and we defined the standards and we developed pricing, and contractors actually bid on the work according to a set list of contract scope and prices that were predefined. And if they didn't want to do that work for those contract prices, they didn't need to come to the table and apply to be a contractor. But one of the things, that was a good technique, that worked well. It brought consistency and parity across the portfolio. So that was one win in this case example. But another one that I thought made a great deal of sense and became a replicable model that we use all the time in post-disaster and also non-disaster conditions is that when we're overseeing multiple contractors, we incentivize the award of more work, in this case, batches or bunches of homes, which were awarded, in 50 or 100 buckets, if you will, of homes by region. And we monitored the contractor performance, 1, for quality, 2, for speed to delivery. So how quickly from when they started the home construction and stabilization to when they finished. Was that a week of interference in the quality of life for community members? Was that 2 weeks? Or did they start construction and then not quite finish for a month? And another house that took 3 weeks and another house that took 5 weeks. So what was the burden on the community? Because contractors that got in and got out did high quality work and for which we didn't get complaints and we didn't get warranty calls in particular. Those are the things we looked at, right? So how quickly did they work, which had everything to do with the burden on leaving nobody behind. How high quality was the work? So when we went in to do the inspection, did they have a 0 findings rating? They passed on the first try. If they passed on the first try and nothing needed to be fixed, they went in, they did the work was done consistent with scope, and they were ready to be paid. We paid the contractor only when the house was done. So that also incentivized them to get it done. And then again, we also looked at the complaint log, warranty calls, that kind of thing, just to make sure that we were really listening to the homeowner, because the inspector who went in may have said, yeah, this work looks great, and the construction work may have been good, but how was the household treated? How were family members treated when construction contractors were on site? Were they respectful? Did they clean up their area? Were they making homeowners feel confident and safe in their own homes? Those obviously were also critical. So those were the things that we did. It was a great practice, and I encourage you to use it as you go forward and are working in an environment where you're overseeing multiple contractors who are fundamentally doing the same thing or same scope or similar scope, and allow you to do apples to apples comparison with regard to performance. So let's talk about contract pricing. So contract pricing, people sometimes get contract delivery and contract pricing confused. And there's a very close relationship between the two, but they're not the same. So your price is how are you structuring how you'll pay your contractors, obviously, that's why it's called contract pricing. There are a few, I'm gonna tell you what they are, you're gonna know them. There is time and materials, with a not to exceed cap. I recommend that not to exceed cap so that you have a control on costs. That not to exceed cap can be proposed by your contractor, but you at the agency should evaluate if that is reasonable and feasible and appropriate for the scope of work as you understand it. So time and materials is a risk shared tool. It's a good tool when you need to get people out in the field repairing urgently needed buildings and infrastructure to stabilize them or get them back to use, or fencing off buildings that are about to collapse so that people are not injured by falling materials, those kinds of things. So whatever you need to do to band-aid the community, keep people safe, that stuff that needs to be done absolutely immediately. Setting up tents for food lines, temporary shelter, all those things, right? These are all your urgent things. Working on a time and materials basis for a tent in a site that's known, like you already have a site, you know that there's running water there, you know what you're gonna do for bathrooms, even if it's porta-johns, and very difficult during COVID, so let's talk about that in a minute, but let's hold it aside for now. You're creating, congregant shelter or feeding services. That scope, even though it's going very quickly, is known. So you could get unit pricing. You could get fixed pricing on what you do. Unit pricing might be better because you want to grow and contract based on the need, and as conditions normalize and become more stable, and as people begin to have the opportunity to go to a grocery store or cook in their own communities or homes safely. So as things come back online, having this elasticity in how things stand up and come back down is important, and unit price makes that nice. But again, when we go back to those building and infrastructure conditions that are unknown, time and materials with a cap is a great option. But you want that scope to be very limited. You want it to be time bound. You don't want time and materials going on for 2 years. You will have cost controls that just absolutely skyrocket potentially, and you'll really be you won't be the alpha in that scope anymore. So you wanna stay in the seat as the alpha. You're the owner. You need to control it in the best interest of the government agency, in the best interest of the taxpayer or whoever's paying for that work, and most importantly, in the best interest of the community members who you are trying to serve. So that's T&M. Short term, make sure it has a cap. Use it limitedly. It's best used when you really don't know what the scope is. Or for certain professional services where you are hiring certain competencies at fixed labor rates, and those fixed labor rates may also have travel built into the cost, insurance, computer equipment. You'll figure out what needs to be included in the price, but you could use fixed labor rates, and then you essentially buy units of labor. So sometimes people consider that a time and materials price contract. Some people consider that a unit price. There isn't necessarily unanimity on that, but either way, they offer different controls and are used with different purposes. Often, architects can't be hired either based on price, because you don't necessarily want to find the cheapest architect or engineer. You want to find the best architect and engineer who is reasonably priced and acceptably priced for you to hire them to do the work. So you hire them based on their qualifications and their competency and their experience, and then you negotiate price. And if you can't negotiate a price with your architect and engineer, and you want them because they do very high quality work, then you just can't enter into a contract with them. You go to your next choice. So if you did a procurement process, you've got a dozen A&E firms that bid on the work, you couldn't negotiate with the first one or the second one because they were too high on price, but you were able to negotiate successfully with the third, hire the third. Now, if you find yourself going from 1 to 2 to 3 to 7 to 10, and you're not negotiating, it means you need to change your price. And you probably need to shut down that procurement. You need to reissue it, even just for a short time, or go back to the other bidders to see if they still are considering working for you. And you might need to reconvene do a rapid cost estimate and go back and renegotiate price. Obviously, those conversations have to happen with your funder if you're not self-funding the project. So that's time and materials, that's fixed labor rates. Let's talk about cost plus fixed fee. Cost plus fixed fee is that you pay for the direct costs that the contractor incurs, and they bring you receipts that clearly show what they bought. And if you get a receipt that doesn't show what they got for the money, you send it back to them, because your contract terms and conditions are going to say that all receipts need to describe clearly the quantity, the item, and the description that was purchased and being charged to you. So you're going to get that documentation for them, and then you're going to have a shift to giving them a fixed fee for overhead and profit. So why do I want a fixed fee and not a percentage of cost? Cost plus percentage of cost is difficult because it incentivizes your contractor to increase actual cost, to increase the profitability of the construction company, because more cost means more profit. So when you shut that down and you segregate the relationship between the direct costs incurred that are well substantiated by the construction contractor and cost plus fixed fee, and then you give them a cost because you have looked at the scope, you have a general understanding of what they're going to do and how much it's going to cost, and you've decided what the profitability should be on that, and you look at past procurements to figure that out and get a good benchmark so that you're kind of spot on and appropriate in terms of the profit and overhead that they should get, and recognizing that their overhead's probably going to go up because, again, they have additional costs associated with your remote island community, exigent circumstances, constrictions to the supply chain, needing to bring in equipment and labor, all of those things. So you're going to have higher direct costs. But when you think about their overhead, you want to just give them an amount, and they get it at the end of the project, period, and it's not negotiated. If there is no change order to the scope, there is no change in their profitability. And even if there is a change order in the scope, you may or may not give them more profit in their fixed fee, or you might enter into discussions for negotiating more money because you gave them more scope. So that's cost plus fixed fee. I actively discourage me, and I think every organization that focuses on procurement and contract integrity recommends against cost plus percentage of cost. You can use unit price too. So unit price is the sister to lump sum. Lump sum is when you have a really clear understanding of the job and you are shifting all the responsibility of your contract. You have great designs, you have walked the site repeatedly, you've dimensioned it, you know what's around it, you know what recovery projects are going to be going on, either that your agency is running or another agency is running. You have a very clear picture on what's going on. That's when you're going to use low bid, lump sum, because you're going to lock in with conditions that are well understood. And that is powerful. It's powerful in allowing you to make sure that the contractor doesn't have cause to be able to come back to you with change orders. So that's lump sum. And then what lives in the middle is fixed fee. So that is a wonderful tool post-disaster. When you think about, you know what the scope is, but you don't know your quantity. Let's say, I'm gonna give you an example, actually. When I was working, again, with the Department of Transportation after a catastrophic disaster, catastrophic flood, they did the initial rapid response contracts, those 80 contracts we talked about, time and materials with a not to exceed cap. That made a lot of sense. But when we did the after action and said, what are our lessons learned? What were the best practices? What did we do here in this post-disaster environment that we want to integrate, the agency wants to integrate as a capacity building or improvement, or we like to say it's a lean process based on that kind of assurance business process for improving quality. So in this process, this hot wash where we looked at what we did and said what went well and what didn't go well, we realized that, they stabilized roads. What does the Department of Transportation do? They build roads all day, every day. And the fact that they had to build them fast really was only a little bit different, not very different from the work they do every day. It was different because they had to work faster, they had to pay premiums on mobilizing workers, they had to pay more because equipment wasn't locally available, so they had to provide an adjustment. We're going to talk about those price adjustments in a second. So they did have to move some pieces around, but at the end of the day, they were doing construction work, and they could have done unit pricing and instead did time and materials. Time and materials was smart, but what did it mean? It meant that it took years to go through every piece of paper and every receipt for every expense and validate it. So the administrative burden and cost on the agency were very high. The lesson learned was transportation is transportation is transportation. We know we need hot mix, we need cold mix, we need paint, we need rollers, we need aggregate of different sizes and types. So they knew what they needed, and they needed those same things after disaster. And what they could have done is just structured the conditions or the terms for negotiating new items that they hadn't thought of, or schedule burdens, right? So if there were overarching requirements that wasn't just about a price that was known to put something in the ground to build the roadway, but there were some things that were different, like these additional mobilization costs, like bringing in additional equipment, those kinds of things. They could have had a mechanism to deal with those outliers on an economic price adjustment basis. And so that's also a mechanism that is an incentive that you can use. You can say, here's what we know, here are the costs that we expect to change, but we don't know by how much. You fix the cost through unit pricing on the things that you do know, and on the unknowns, you create a mechanism for how you're going to evaluate fair and reasonable price negotiation with the contractor. Maybe either as an increase to a cost that's already been established and agreed to, or as just a new item. So I wanted you to think about that. Again, I talked about mobilization fees. Sometimes you really need to pay mobilization because the scale of the disaster requires bringing people into a remote island community that aren't normally there, and the contractor just simply cannot cash flow the amount of work, or they want assurance that they're not going to show up to your remote island community and then, oh, the work isn't there because the supply chain isn't in place yet. That goes back to my recommendation that you really think about your supply chain in remote island communities as part of what you're doing. So you can also have incentives I talked about previously for milestone completion, and why certain milestones might be contingencies in the schedule for projects, for a single project, for a number of projects, or for projects that are adjacent, unrelated, but still absolutely critical to long-term recovery or stabilization of the new normal in post-disaster conditions for your community. So be looking at your contract pricing method. Think about the type, think about whether or not the scope is known, think about the shared risk between you and the contractor and how much risk you can transfer and tolerate, because you pay more, right? You sell risk. You don't just give risk away to the contractor. They don't just accept it. They bid on it and you pay for it. So think about how much you want to sell to them for the assurance that their prices will not change. How rock solid is your scope to make sure that they can't come to you with changes? And then are there incentives in place for the predictability of meeting milestones, the end of construction, and predictability of cost? All of these things will inform the contract pricing that you use. So let's talk about another example for structuring for performance. So what do I mean by structuring for performance? I am talking about exceeding code minimums for resilience. So establishing your asset performance standards. How will they be built? Are they built to international resilient codes? Which ones? Are there exceptions to codes because your remote island community does plumbing differently, or it's different water treatment or power generation that is a little bit different, or is going to change as a result of the disaster based on the damages and where you're going. So at the beginning, you know, all the power generation might need to be remote and all generator, and then by the time the power gets restored, which might be, you know, 3 months or 6 months or a year, or the system be replaced in a portfolio of projects, what does it mean if people can then just, you know, plug in to power that's available on site, and what does that do to the price? So structure for performance. What are you doing for resilient terms? Are you following professional consensus standards? If so, which ones? Put them in the contract. Are you designing to accommodate adjustments for changing climate conditions, right? We know that if you're building an asset that is supposed to stand for 50 years or 100 years, that the science available to us about sea level rise, about high heat conditions, about drought, about major kind of arc storms, these major rainstorms where you get, 5 feet of water in a matter of 5 hours. What kind of conditions are you contemplating? When are they going to happen? We don't always know that. So define a maximum credible event or a black swan, the max of max. How bad could it get? Design your asset performance standards to be able to tolerate that if you can afford to do it. And if not, if you're specifying an asset that cannot withstand the highest conditions, understand when you think your program, when it will fail. Are you going to, is it going to be able to withstand a 7.0 earthquake, or is it going to be able to withstand a 9.0 earthquake, or a category 3 hurricane, or category 5 hurricane, or a different category of cyclone? Being real clear about what you're building to and how your asset performs is critically important so that you buy the product you want, and you also can alert the community on safety. So I'll give you an example. On some roadway conditions, it was too expensive on hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of roadway or miles of roadway to make everything completely robust against a major flood, right? A 500-year return rate flood event. That wasn't realistic. It wasn't cost effective in rural areas. So what can you do? Well, you might specify a roadway like Colorado DOT did in certain circumstances so that the roadway could tolerate more overtopping. And so they picked the materials and specified in the procurement what they wanted to do to be able to do that, so that things were essentially built to fail or built to tolerate conditions where they may or may not survive, because it was more cost reasonable, cost effective, and available in the budget to build something that was going to work in most conditions, work in moderate disaster conditions, but not work in extreme conditions. And that also meant that they looked at redundant routes. They looked at whether or not there was another way to get from point A to point B, to move supplies, to move people to emergency services, to get to hospitals and healthcare, to get to government essential services. All of those things were considered when figuring out what the right level was for protection for what was being built, either in the rapid response phase just to restore and stabilize conditions, or permanent recovery. And this goes back to sort of building a longer table and getting people there to help you think about the right specifications and the scope of work. You as procurement professionals can't do this alone, so you want to make sure you have a great community you can rely on, so that together you can tease out all of those things and make decisions in the context of available resources, in the context of urgency, in the context of durability, and the threats that you face. So with regard to climate threats, I was saying that sometimes we don't have the science to know what the sea level rise is going to be, or how severe things are going to get. And so sometimes you can build in your specifications accommodation for climate adjustments, essentially. And what that means is that you build a pivot point in your useful life. You're building a 50-year asset. You're going to build it really solid for 20 years, but you want to be able to assess again at year 20 if this asset is going to go to 50 or 100, or if you're actually going to demobilize this asset or change this asset to do something different because the risk projections were too low or the risk projections were too aggressive. So try to build in some flex as you create accommodation for climate adaptation and climate change during the useful life of the asset that you're building, particularly in long-term recovery. And again, I mentioned it, bring those asset managers to the table. You need to know how it's going to be performed, how the asset is going to perform, who's going to fix it, what fixes it needs, when it needs day-to-day maintenance, when it needs capital, a recapitalization. So is it going to need recapitalization at year 15 or year 40? What does that mean for the money you need to come up with? What does that do? If you maintain the asset more frequently, can you, regular asset, regular maintenance, can you then push the recap or CapEx, the reconstruction of the asset from year 20 to year 35? And will that save you money? So again, get those asset managers at the table and make sure that you have a program for maintaining the asset that you built so that you're not creating a legacy of deferred maintenance for your community. You know, many of us struggle with that on a regular basis. And if you could avoid contributing to it on major capital projects, you certainly want to do that. And you need to be informed by the people who are experts in your organization or in your community to assist with that. So let's talk about designing to net zero. That's a case example where we're designing to a sustainably built asset. AECOM designed a facility for Salt Lake City in Utah, which is not remote but has extreme climate conditions. And the mayor was very committed to sustainability, to resilience, to greenhouse gas reduction, and actually led a group of the U.S. Council of Mayors specifically on that topic to promote climate adaptation across the United States. So what does that mean for the procurement person? Great, you're going to build a resilient asset. What did we build? A net zero water recycling facility, the first net zero water recycling facility in the United States. So as a procurement professional, what does that mean? It means that you recognize that this is not just building a code. This is not just building something known. It's doing something new, knowing that you don't just need water engineers at the table, but you need climate experts, you need resilience experts, you need greenhouse gas reduction experts, all coming together and to be part of the team. But you can't pay for innovation that goes on forever, right? You can't build a road to nowhere. You can't pay and not get the asset built. So it's the perfection is the enemy of the good, and building that in the contract. You want innovation. You need to figure out your budget for ideation and new ideas and driving to net zero. And you need those ideas to be compensated within limits, define limits, and you have to define the expectation for when you want those ideas to come. You are going to bring 3 alternatives at a schematic level for reducing greenhouse gas emissions within the first 90 days of the contract, or whatever the terms are for you, and when decisions are going to be made. When done is done, and the decisions that are made are the decisions that are built. So you can do it, you can be innovative. It's the challenge of our generation and the next generation to build resilient and climate adaptive and sustainable buildings and infrastructure, but we need to create an environment for innovation while managing costs and schedule, and we're just all going to learn together about how to do this, and that's really starting to happen, and there's lots of good precedent and examples out there that we can look to. This net zero wastewater facility in Salt Lake City is one of them. So let's also talk about structuring for co-benefits. We've been talking a lot about resilience and climate adaptation and environmental sustainability and sustainably built assets already. We talked about those things. Let's also talk about quality of life for people and communities. Let's talk about considering the needs of vulnerable populations to leave no one behind by design in your building and infrastructure procurements, and seeing that relationship is very close, because people live in spaces and places, and you're creating them through the scope that you develop with your team for this procurement. And also consider history, cultural resources, archaeological resources, and culture bearing. A lot of people, unless they're regulated by law, don't include those things in their portfolio, and I want to challenge you to do that. I want to challenge you to build and recover from disaster in a way that promotes pride in the community, that promotes identity, that carries forward the legacy of who the people in the community are, the places and the cultures they come from, and that carries them forward. In particular, after a major catastrophic disaster, when so many old structures fail, so many historic structures fail, there is a terrible sense of loss of places that were places of beauty, that were places of faith or cultural importance. And there's a real mourning that goes on among community members, and that includes members of your team who feel the loss. So what can be done to restore those assets and those places? What can be done if you cannot rebuild to acknowledge and exhibit and tell the stories of as part of the new building project that you put in the scope of work for the new facility or asset, and or what can be done to provide for culture bearing? So for example, if you have a construction program and you're rebuilding a portfolio of assets and you have indigenous communities in your on your remote island community, and those voices need to be heard, you can require that there's technical advisement by indigenous cultures or people who represent the ideas and the culture of indigenous peoples or First Nations on the project. So you could either designate a center or an organization they work with, or they could work with professionals who are members of the community and have been acknowledged and kind of vetted by the community they represent, the cultural or indigenous or First Nation community they represent. And they should be looking at the plans and saying, you know, that's not how we're going to use this space. We're not going to sit in those chairs in this formation. We're going to be sitting in a circle, and here's what we're sitting on. Those kinds of things make a world of difference. Or this is why this space has to be set up in a circle and not a square or a rectangle, because of our practice and our ceremony or our reflection or faith-based belief. So making sure you have that cultural competency, that you specify when you're going to be including cultural symbols, quotes, identity into the fabric, literally into the fabric of the building and the space is important. And particularly in post-disaster conditions, it's very affirming to community members to see that culture bearing become incorporated into their spaces, and to acknowledge how people want to live and come together as a community. So you have the right to do it. I encourage you to do it. It's kind of a novel idea. It's not done a lot. But if you, in these challenging conditions we face post-disaster, with the threats of climate change, with the threats sometimes to our culture, we need to build in markers, and you have the right and responsibility to do it, and often you can do it with almost no cost to the project, or very nominal cost. And so the reward or the return on that investment is manyfold and can go on for generations. So I'm going to give you an example of sustainable and resilient assets. I worked on schools recovery for Hurricane Katrina. They had in New Orleans, they had 500 buildings on 132 campuses. Of those, 400 of those buildings were significantly damaged. Over 250 were catastrophically damaged, and over half that portfolio was historic. And so the rebuilding of that program involved, one, consulting with the community. The school, this is a little bit different because New Orleans is not a remote island community. Although culturally it's very unique in America, and sometimes we like to call it the country of New Orleans. It's a really incredible and dynamic and beautiful place with rich heritage and culture. So we said, the buildings that were built when the city was much bigger, was 4 times the size of it was pre-Katrina, and then it continued to contract after Katrina. So we were able to work with the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the Governor's Office on Homeland Security and Emergency Management, GOSEP, the State Emergency Management Office, to broker agreements about building what was needed going forward for the community post-Katrina. And so the U.S. Congress passed a special rule that said for Katrina impacted schools and some other facilities in Louisiana and Mississippi, FEMA funds could be used to be flexible. Instead of returning exactly to pre-disaster condition or pre-disaster functioning capacity, we could use the eligible money based on the value of damages for pre-disaster functioning capacity. And let me say that we were very lucky to have a federal program, that we are in the United States very lucky to have a federal program that provides a tremendous amount of dollars for rapid response and resilient recovery. Sometimes that covers 100% of emergency cost or 90% of emergency cost, and 75%, and in catastrophes sometimes more than that, in the cost share between the local government and the federal government to pay for these investments. So I want to acknowledge that and recognize that is not the case everywhere. Many remote island communities around the world do not enjoy that benefit. So I want to be thoughtful, and I want to acknowledge that and recognize that the conditions that you face in this respect can be much more challenging when you don't have funding and you're faced with really threatening, life-affecting conditions in the near term, and as you look forward to multi-generational impacts of the disasters that you're responding to. But going back to this example, Congress passed a little law that let the schools build what they needed to go forward. And we were really excited to go into a process with the community and develop a schools facilities master plan for Orleans Parish. Parish is a term for a county or a small region in the United States that's within a state. So there are states, then there are counties, then there are units of local government or cities. And this master plan involved over 200 community meetings. Local community meetings. Of course, we had the benefit of not having a pandemic, so we were able to do those face-to-face. And the community meetings defined the needs of the community, the educational goals for children kind of 5 through 19, or K through high school, K through 12, as we like to say in the United States, so pre-university, whether students go to university or not. This is all of the education that happens before a student goes to university. That isn't child care, infant care, early childhood care. This is in the school system. They now have early childhood, so it actually starts with 4-year-olds now. That's exciting. But we talked to parents and caregivers and said, what do you need? What was going well? How was the education working for children? What wasn't working? Tell me about the curriculum. Tell me about the facilities. Tell me about what you think the children need, whether it's academic instruction or recreation, sports, arts, music, and culture are a key driver at the center of life in New Orleans. So how can that be rebuilt? How can there be a structure that grows and supports that in post-Katrina New Orleans? So all of those conversations were very important. And for the first time in a city that has experienced has a long history of having experienced slavery and challenges post-Reconstruction and suffering from Jim Crow laws and segregation. Since segregation, no one had rebuilt the schools, right? In fact, some newer schools had been built right before a Supreme Court decision that was trying to justify separate but equal, which promoted the idea of segregation and not integration in the United States. And it was a case that was a local case. And so there was a lack of parity. So there were schools that were built for white boys, and those were entirely different facilities, even damaged facilities, than schools that were built for Black girls. So we had the responsibility to create parity, equity, curricular innovation that dealt with academic growth, that dealt with culture bearing, that dealt with addressing the legacy of racism that was literally physically embedded in their physical plan and plant. And in reconstructing the schools, which had 40,000 children out of education, so we had 40,000 children who had nowhere to go during the day, we were able to ask the community what they want. And based on what they want, we were also able to develop resilient asset building performance standards. We were able to work quickly on rapid reoccupancy and use temporary facilities to help facilitate that. We were also able to, although we wanted to build the schools to be shelters, the school district couldn't afford it. And I say we, I didn't work directly for them. I worked as a consultant to them. And so I want to clarify my role. I say we because I was embedded with the team for half a decade, and it's very important to me. And so I ask my colleagues to forgive me. They know that we call it the royal we. The work was really important, and we wanted the schools to be shelters, but we really didn't have money. There wasn't enough money to fix the schools, build parity into the programming, build a system that would flex, that we could build based on repopulation projections and trying to understand where people were building back what hazard conditions they faced in building back, if they were in areas that had a higher rate of flooding risk, for example. So we were able to build back to sustainable building standards. We followed LEED Silver standards for sustainable building. We were compelled to and delighted to work with the State Historic Preservation Officer and follow the U.S. Secretary of Interior standards for historic rehabilitation. Over half the portfolio was historic rebuilding, and so in this program that was almost $2 billion, almost $1 billion went into historic rehabilitation, which was again really important for telling the story of the community and culture bearing and bringing communities back online, but making them live in a modern way and provide educational equity and parity in school programming that really reflected the values of the community and that consulted with the community. So that was a tremendous success, this program. And so while we couldn't build back to make every school a shelter, for example, post-disaster, we were able to think about how we were going to get the facility built back online. So we restored historic terrazzo, we used split-face block and other durable building materials that could be hosed down if the facility, and then scrubbed down and sanitized safely if there had been flooding, and we could get contaminants out of the facility very quickly, and also make sure that if it wasn't ready to go into community use, and many schools were built to be multifunctional so that they could be used as schools during the day and used for community-based programming, whether it was for theater, whether it was for adult education, vocational education, arts enrichment during out-of-school time. So those designs were built into the school program at the request of the community, and that has been a tremendous success. But we also are ready to do a rapid conversion to post-disaster sheltering if needed and get the schools back online. So that's something that I'm really proud to share with you and excited about. So come to New Orleans if you can and have a look at those schools. So I also want to talk for the last few minutes about structuring for dynamic conditions and concurrent hazards, the pandemic being one of them. So I'm going to give you some examples in addition to the pandemic, which when you're having a natural disaster during a pandemic, as was the case in St. Vincent and the Grenadines with the recent volcanic explosive volcanic event, there were cyber attacks on infrastructure after flash flooding during the pandemic in New York City recently. Hurricane Katrina and Rita were hit only weeks apart with major impacts in Louisiana. In Louisiana also, in 2019, had Hurricanes Laura and Delta in the same season, hitting with overlapped impact areas and also creating multiple disaster zones that took up a much wider part of the state. Hurricanes Irma and Maria hitting with back-to-back Cat 5s, as I said earlier, only 12 days apart in the Caribbean, is another example. So when we do our post-disaster work for rapid recovery, and more importantly for long-term recovery, we have to contemplate that another disaster is going to come along, whether it's a pandemic or something else, or pandemic and something else, while we're still in construction and before the work is done. And so you want to have methods of control and clear understanding with your contractors to make sure that you know who is responsible for what, who pays for what, when the contract remains in force, when the contract can be canceled, and by whom, with what terms. So this is something I just want to put out there. I want you to think about insurable risk, to make sure that you know who's paying for shock impacts. So if you have a school or a water facility or another a courthouse under construction and it's damaged because you get a cyclone or you get an earthquake that follows a cyclone a year into construction, who is paying to get that back to where it was before the earthquake damage? Is it you as owner? Is it your responsibility? And where's that money coming from? And do you have insurance for it? Or is it part of the insurance requirement, sorry for the competing noise, as a method of control? So it all goes back to your terms and conditions, and having robust terms and conditions. That's really the conversation we're having today overall on everything that we're talking about. I also want you to think about, if you have a disaster while you have construction in place, what can you do, one, to get back online Are you going to use your construction firm or your architecture and engineering firm to go out and assess damage if while you're under construction with one program you get more impacts from another? If so, put it in their contract. Even if you don't come up with the terms and conditions for compensation, you can do a $0 award or adjustment, or just include it in their contract indicating that they will be paid under fixed labor rates that are already defined in the contract, or include those fixed labor rates for that purpose in your plan so that you're planning for the next event during the current one. And then also think about in the pandemic, we've all learned a lot. Translate what you've learned into your practices today. So are you going to, I encourage you to have strong programs for testing employees, for testing and tracing, for health monitoring, for standards of care, for physical distance, for wearing masks, for hygiene, for making sure that there's sanitization standards and places for people to wash their hands and sanitize that you might not normally have on a construction job site, or you might have only one and it might be a really far walk. Well, that doesn't work now. You might need to have more of them than you normally would to maintain a mitigated hazard environment so work can continue. What are the rules if somebody gets sick with regard to isolation of the employee, but also with regard to quarantine of the other employees? And who is paying for that? Are you going to send the quarantined employee to a designated location that you've already arranged and you've paid for? Or is it the responsibility of the contractor? And again, who pays if the individual needs to quarantine away from their household because they were exposed to someone with the pandemic? So only you will know the answers on your project delivery, on your cost, on your scope of work, on adding co-benefits for resilience, adaptation, environmental sustainability, catalyzing the local and regional economy, all of these things that you are going to contemplate and think about. Near-term and rapid response, long-term for long-term recovery. The most important thing is that you gather the people around you, that you protect your process so that you choose the best value for the community at the best price for the goals you're trying to accomplish. And you understand your funding requirements are folded into your terms and conditions, as is everything else that we've talked about today. I know you spent a lot of time listening to me talk about procurement and contracting. I hope it was a good use of your time, and you'll be able to draw on this discussion as you start to think about how you're going to gather your team today during Blue Skies to prepare for rapid response and resilient recovery, long-term recovery after the next big event, which is not an if, but a when. I wish you well and safety in your community as you face these challenges, and I'm glad that you're at the table helping them do the best job possible for the long-term health of the community. Thanks so much.